Welcome to my first healthcare podcast of TigerLily's Freedom Roar. I'm your host, Lily Gonzalez, former RN, and I want to thank my guest, John James, PhD, for taking the time to be interviewed. Dr. James received his BA in Physics, Mathematics, and Astronomy from the University of Kansas in 1968. He earned an MA in Astronomy from the University of Virginia in 1970, an MA in Chemistry from the University of Maryland College Park in 1977, and a PhD in Pathology from the Graduate School of the University of Maryland School of Medicine in Baltimore, 1982. You did recently retire, right, Dr. James?
Yes, that's right, Lily, I did.
Yeah, as you were chief toxicologist for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, where you led the space toxicology office located at the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Am I correct?
That's right, for just about a quarter of a century.
Oh my gosh, okay. Well, then in 1986, Dr. James became a diplomat of the American Board of Toxicology. But the reason I'm interviewing Dr. James today is to promote his book, A Sea of Broken Hearts, Patient Rights in a Dangerous Profit-Driven Healthcare System. Welcome, Dr. James. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Lily. Thank you for the welcome, and I'm doing great. It's good to talk with you.
Thanks. And first, I want to express my deepest condolences for the loss of your son. I just cannot imagine what that feels like. I couldn't put your book down. I connected with you on various levels. I have a son that was also born in 1982. He's been in and out of the hospital just because of bonehead motorcycle accidents, but he's given me a grandson now, and I am very sorry for your loss.
Well, thank you for your kind words.
So I couldn't put the book down. As I said, I connected with you on that kind of like parental aspect. Also, I connected with you because you talk about Texas a lot. I raised both of my kids they were born in Camp Pendleton. My husband and I were both in the military out there in the Marines. But I raised them in Kerrville, Texas. And then I became a registered nurse just as they were, finishing high school. And I can't, one of the things I do now is I am a big advocate of people learning how to navigate a very dysfunctional, complex healthcare system that I discovered. And what you did in your book really illustrated so beautifully the problem that we have in our healthcare system today. It's multi-level, and how can I put it? A lot of people say it's just a few bad apples. There's a problem with the barrel, and it's a whole system of problems in our healthcare system that I got to see firsthand for 10 years that burned me out. The stuff that I saw behind the scenes, a lot of people might not even believe them unless they knew me and knew the type of personality that I am and that I do tell the truth. So what can you tell me just a brief description of your book and what compelled you to write your book?
Well, I wrote my book in 2007, which was 5 years after my son died. And in it, I try to teach the reader a little bit of basic cardiology. He was under the care of cardiologist, and then show how his cardiologists as a team missed his fundamental problem, which I won't describe now because you can read the book and find that. But what I also realized, and what really impelled me to write the book, was that his story was not unique, that several 100,000 people at least every year in the United States have their lives cut short by medical errors, and that most of this is not even known. It was only just beginning to emerge in the 2000s that this was in fact so. In the 2000, the Institute of Medicine declared it was about 98,000 people that lost their lives each year. But it's clear now that it's many more than that. But yet little has been done. And so by 2007, I was feeling very angry, if you will, at the system that allowed doctors to practice with so little knowledge of cardiology and call themselves cardiologists. So I wrote the book, and my last chapter is what I think is a solution to the problem, which is a Bill of Rights that every patient should have if they're seeking treatment in the United States.
Right. Now, I deliberately, at the top of the podcast, talked about your credentials because one of the things that I have told that I advocate is that everybody should have a patient advocate. And the fact that you are so well credentialed and that something like this could happen to your child speaks volumes about the misinformation that's out there. And I love what you said about how many people are actually being harmed. And that was something that I knew when I was doing nursing advocacy and patient advocacy when I was a nurse about that To Err is Human report. But more recently, the numbers are something like between 220,000 to 440,000 people are being killed as a result of medical types of errors. And that would make it the third leading cause of death in America. And when you consider that 10,000 people, according to the CDC, I call it the Centers for Disease Continuation, according to them, 10,000 people are killed because of drunk driving. When you crunch the numbers, there's about 25 people a day that are killed by drunk drivers, whereas doctors are killing almost twice that many people every hour of every day. This is an absolute crisis. And you found this out by way of your investigation. So what is the most interesting, shocking thing that you found out and as a result of writing your book and your research?
There's several contenders for that, and so rather than pick one, I was shocked first of all at how little doctors could know and still practice medicine. The continuing medical education for doctors leaves you with your mouth open as far as you've got to be kidding. This is all they do to continue to call themselves cardiologists. And board-certified cardiologists that were certified before 1990 are certified for life with no effort made for them on their part to have to recertify. And my son's lead cardiologist was in that category. I think the other thing, and this is a touchy subject for doctors, is the falsification of medical records. My son's medical records were highly falsified. You don't have to trust me on that. You can look at them and see that things that are in his records cannot both be true. And they basically tried to push the cause of his death back on him. And they tried to assert that he refused a pacemaker, when in fact the only thing he was ever offered was a loop monitor, which doesn't really do anything, it just monitors. But they falsified his medical records, and they get away with it. That happens all the time. So I guess I was shocked that people that we trust, our doctors, are willing to do that to cover up their mistakes.
Right. And as a former nurse, I think that a lot of times nurses are the last checkpoint, if you will, for safety of a patient. But when nurses are afraid to call doctors, that is a problem. And it's not just nurses that are afraid to call doctors, but it's also doctors. And I want to just read to you really quickly this other book that I'm reading. And by the way, your book, I would have read it in one day if I hadn't started it so late in the day. It was like a mystery novel. It was just so wonderful. I loved your book. But here, this Dr. Martin Macari, I don't know if you've heard the name, he wrote a book called Unaccountable, in which he talks about some of the key points that you made in your book. And he said that every intern, he says, in many hospitals, interns are discouraged from asking senior physicians for help even when they desperately need it. Every intern knows the feeling. In fact, when I heard that this Mount Sinai intern didn't call promptly, I had flashbacks of a personal nightmare I experienced at DC General Hospital when 12 trauma patients rolled in on the same night. Already instilled with the warning to be very cautious about not bothering seniors for help at night, I timidly called my chief resident asking him to come down to help me. "Why are you calling me?" my chief barked. "Because there are 12 trauma patients here, sir," I explained. Obviously annoyed, he asked, "Well, what are you going to do for their injuries?" He was clearly angry, and he's, quote, "I don't know because I've only seen 2 of them so far, but I could really use your help when it's just me down here," I said, in shock that we even needed to be conversing about the need for him to come down. To my surprise and utter horror, he then shouted, "Dr. Marty Macri, you need to learn how to get organized," and hung up on me. He never came down that night. That night, I did my best to bandage, sew, and manage 12 trauma patients with only 1 medical student helping me. 2 of those patients died. Now, Dr. James, this is what I went through in terms of, I never feared calling a doctor, but the very first time I ever did call one, I got the F word thrown at me and I got hung up on. And that was in San Antonio, Texas. And that was my first awakening of, oh my gosh. And what this other book, the epiphany that I had, is that nurses, because they don't work for doctors, they have their own licenses and they're registered and they work apart from them. They is supposed to be working in collaboration. They have really more power to get things done, to make doctors do what needs to be done than other doctors, residents, for example. So there's so much dysfunction that goes on in the hospital setting because of this arrogance and it's this authority, this they put a white coat on, and we the sheeple look up to them for and believe them, and it's a revolving door of problems that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I'm not at all surprised that you found lies in the medical records that you sought. I did notice that you said that you were kind of sheepish or shy in asking to get the medical records for your son after he had passed on. Why were you afraid, or what was that hesitance that you felt?
Well, I had always been taught, I guess, that medical records were for exchange between doctors, that patients and their advocates and so on really shouldn't be reading that high-level stuff that doctors speak to each other in. I was wrong. I know that now. And I actually worked with some doctors, and I had asked a doctor at my federal institute to actually apply for the medical records for me, and I got this anemic little quarter-inch pile. And then I talked to a lawyer, and he said, "There's no way that's all your son's medical records." And eventually I got something that was about 2.5 inches thick. I might want to say something about McCary's book. I have met Dr. Martin McCary. He's a remarkable guy. Took a lot of courage to write the book he did.
Absolutely.
One thing I remember about that book is he speaks about a meeting where perhaps 3,000 physicians were present, and the question was laid on the table: how many of you know a colleague who is a danger to his patients? And without exception, every person in the room put up their hand. Now, that is a lot of doctors, and that is a lot of doctors who know other doctors that are a danger to their patient, but they don't dare say anything. And that's the way with nurses. If you want a solution to that, and my federal agency was starting to do this before I retired, it's called 360-degree evaluations. They are anonymous evaluations done by your subordinates, your colleagues, and your bosses. And so nurses would have the opportunity to say anonymously, this doctor has been abusive to me, he's abused patients, he doesn't know what he's doing. Doctors could say that about each other, and eventually and nurses for that matter. There are nurses that don't know what they're doing or are abusive or rude consistently. You're not going to pull somebody out because of one bad night. But if a professional in a hospital is constantly abusive and hard to work with and a danger to their patients, they need to be plucked out. And as far as I know, that's not done in hospitals now at all. I think hospital administrators would be frightened to do that because what they would find out would shock them.
Oh, yes. Now, you talk about this patient's rights thing. I am of the opinion that it is the government that has kind of caused some of the problem. In other words, you've got these doctors who have engaged, and they are so intertwined with government and that authority, that how is it, I'm more of the opinion of repealing laws as opposed to making more laws. If you can repeal the laws that are protecting these doctors, then do you see an opportunity for maybe having more of an eBay type of a healthcare system where people can get online? And right now there's laws that you know, things that you sign by doctors. I read in Dr. Macary's book that somebody yelped about their health care that they got from a doctor, and that person was ended up getting a lawsuit, you know, was being sued for $200,000 because he had signed in fine print that he wasn't going to be, you know, exposing anything. That's some dangerous stuff to do, but they have the protection of the government. How do you see that more government and more laws would help as opposed to hinder more?
Yeah, Lily, I share your natural inclination to have fewer laws. I do think if I were to ride a motorcycle, I would have a helmet on. But it's hard to put your hands around the fundamental problem with the way the medical care system is in this country. It contrasts with systems in other countries because it is very much oriented about making as much money as you can. You may know that per person, the cost of healthcare in our country is about twice what it is in any other developed country. But our outcomes are terrible. Our life expectancy, our infant mortality, basic measurements of how functional the system is are terrible. We're something like 40th in the world for infant mortality. Come on. What's wrong with us? Why can't we do better? Well, it's because you don't make money. And so with that perverse incentive behind the medical system we've got, I don't see how you can withdraw laws and get a safer patient care situation.
Right.
If you could take the money out of medicine, I think maybe you would have a chance. But I really think a Bill of Rights, and I use there kind of a model from the civil rights movement. You know, regardless of your race, you have certain basic rights. Sexual preferences, you have certain rights, at least in most places. And why shouldn't you as a patient have the right to enough transparency and accountability in the system in which you're trusting your life to believe that you're going to get safe care? We're nowhere near that now. And I don't see that happening unless you're given certain rights, like really informed consent. Not a bunch of this. For example, my son fear was used on him to get his informed consent. That's one of the lowest forms of human interaction, as far as I'm concerned, is when you want to make money invading this young man's body and you scare the hell out of him to do it. I mean, what kind of ethics is that? But that's what they did. And doctors do that all the time. They have subtle ways. Oh, well, we see a mass here, but we really don't know what it is. You know, I had a patient a few years ago that had something like this, and they're dead now. there's all sorts of ways of manipulating people to sell your product. And so I don't know. In principle, I agree with you. Fewer laws would be good. If we could go out and beat our doctors up when they do malpractice and get away with it, that would be fine. But it doesn't work that way.
Right. It just really touched my heart, the way you did your book in the chronological way. You humanized your son. Every registered nurse should read this book. Everybody in healthcare should read this book. I learned more about cardiology from reading your book than I did from any advanced cardiovascular, ACLS class or certification I ever had to take, or from nursing school, and I graduated at the University of Texas Health Science Center. I learned more about the heart, about cardiology from your book, from somebody who's not a cardiologist, but who's a critical thinker, and you had a passion and a mission to get justice for your son. And I think that you have found justice by writing this book, Dr. James.
Well, I thank you. And in some cases, it seems to have made a difference. I got an email a few years after I wrote the book from a woman who's now the head of the cardiology unit. And she said, your book struck a chord with me because I have children also. And I have for years tried to get my colleagues to pay more attention to potassium, and they don't do it. And so she said, I think your book will encourage my colleagues to start paying more attention to this. The problem with that is you don't make any money replacing potassium in a patient that's depleted. And if you don't make any money, well, okay, it's not going to pay much attention to that. If you can sell them a cardiac catheterization or an elective physiology test, you can make some good money doing that. And that's what they did to my son. And so the hope is that there will be change here. Are we going to make all doctors righteous and patient-centered? Ain't going to happen.
Right.
I understand what you're saying about nurses. Nurses are kind of a liability in most hospitals. They're salaried, and so they're on the ledger as an expense, whereas the doctors tend to be kind of free-floating, and they bring customers in. Mm-hmm. And so hospitals, when their balance sheet isn't so good, tend to cut nursing staff. And they know there's little or no accountability, certainly in my state of Texas, for errors. They just keep going on. So right. It's not a pretty picture if you're a patient. And so I go back to what you said. You need an advocate. You have to have control of your medical records and know what's going on. And you got to ask questions until they hate you.
And they will hate you. And I know even nurses, when I did a lot of labor and delivery, nurses hated when they had a birthing plan. The moms had a whole birthing plan. What would you tell somebody who is contemplating entering the healthcare profession?
I would say if you're entering it to make big money, we don't want you.
Thank you.
If you're entering it because you really care about other people and can keep that through hard times in medical school, and when there are perverse incentives for you to make money rather than deliver patient-centered care, if you can resist that, then stay in the medical profession, stay true and honest, know you're going to make mistakes, be ready to deal with those and meet the victims halfway, and resist being bullied by administrators and senior colleagues. And I think you'll be okay, but you're going to be a rare commodity in the system as it exists now.
I all I wanted was to get a 4-year degree, and I had VA benefits. And so I took a test, and the VA vocational guy said, I ranked at the very bottom for nursing. And he said, well, we have a nursing shortage. So if you want us to pay for your education, you got to be a nurse. And I said, but clearly I don't fit the mold. I mean, how about a doctor? Because I'd rather be a doctor because I thought I could do more as a doctor, be more of a benefit to humanity. And they said, no, we don't have a doctor shortage, nursing. And I said, well, what if I get into a 4-year nursing program? Will you pay for that? And they said, if you can even get in, we'll pay for it. They didn't think I could get in, but I had I got in. And so from there, it was, I mentioned before we started the interview, my first encounter with the doctor, but calling them, waking them up, they don't like it. But then 9/11 happened, and so I thought, well, I really want to see the world and everything. So the way that I got my power back as a registered nurse was to become a contract nurse. This way, I don't work for the hospital directly. I'm working for an agency, and I have much more freedom. I'm not afraid. I wouldn't be afraid to call a doctor or to tattletale or to expose. Because what's the worst that can happen? They'll cancel my contract, and I never had a contract canceled. And in fact, my very last job, when I was interviewed, I really didn't want to be a nurse anymore, and I told my husband, I will only be a nurse for 1 more year. I'm going to let all my licenses expire, and it's got to be mother-baby. It's got to be in California because they have nurse-to-patient ratios, and it's got to be in this specific area. And there was like 2 places that I could have interviewed, and I went to the first place, and the nurse manager is asking me, well, how would you do this, and how would you, the scenarios, and she said, how would you deal with a doctor who is being a bully? And I says, well, let me just tell you something. They might try to bully me once, and if they say a swear word, they're going to get a swear word back. And so I was I was like hoping that she was like, okay, next, so that I wouldn't get the job. And she says, I've got a couple of doctors that I'd like you to write up. Can you start next week? I'm like, I cannot believe it. So there is a way to keep your sense of virtue in healthcare, but it's a very tight ship, and I think that Dr. McAray's book is somewhat of an atonement for some of the confessions that he makes. And I think I want to follow in his footsteps and maybe write a book called Confessions of an American RN, the types of things that I saw. So, sorry to go on about that. I'll probably edit some of that out. So, what advice would you give to those currently in healthcare who do not report harmful errors or misconduct?
Well, I would say that you are part of the problem. It's one thing to make a mistake. We all are going to make mistakes. But when people are being harmed because your colleagues are making mistakes and you don't say anything, that's unfortunate. And I might mention there's a study published in 2007. The lead author was Eric Campbell, and he asked different types of doctors, do you have firsthand knowledge of a medical error you refuse to report to anyone in authority? And cardiologists of the specialists assessed were the highest, and I believe it was about 2/3 of cardiologists admitted that they had firsthand knowledge of a medical error, and that could have been their own or one of their colleagues that they observed, and refused to report it to anyone in authority. So it really is a big problem. And as I said earlier, this 360-degree evaluation is the only way I know to tease this out and start getting the doctors that have a drug abuse problem, an alcohol problem, or they're psychotic or something, or they just are behind the intellectual power curve. They haven't kept up with their discipline, and they're a danger to their patients because of it. Those doctors need to be rehabilitated or gotten out of the system. And the only way you're going to do it is anonymous reviews. And I can remember speaking to a group of nurses once, actually down at UT Health Science Center in Houston. And afterward, several of them came up to me and said, I can't wait to retire and tell the stories I know. So you are not alone in the nursing community in knowing stories that would probably shock us all.
And go ahead.
Anyway, that's a kind of a long answer to your question, but if I were stuck and I were a doctor and I thought I was in a situation where a lot of my colleagues were not competent, I would sit down with the head of my hospital or where I have privileges and say, I've heard about this 360-degree review system, and I think you need to consider putting it in your hospital because you got some things you need to know that you don't know.
Very well said. So what advice would you give to your friends and family and neighbors to avoid falling prey to the dysfunction that you uncovered in your research?
I would say, first of all, do your homework. If you have the time, figure out as best you can which hospitals and doctors are the best in your area. Honestly, that's not easy to do now. The hope is that in a few years we'll be able to do that and trust the database, but it's not really there yet. So do that to the extent you can. Then, if you can do it, have a patient advocate that's assertive and knowledgeable go with you to the hospital and look after you. There's a book written a few years ago by a woman named Jody Gittlehofer called High Performance Healthcare. And she had analyzed Southwest Airlines and showed why they were so effective as a corporation. And what she found in hospitals is that the only person that integrates the care of a patient in a hospital is the advocate. And that's pretty scary if you don't have an advocate. Who is putting the pieces of your puzzle together so that you get optimal care? And if you don't have an advocate, it's nobody. So consider that. You got to have an advocate, get control of your medical records, look at them, make sure you understand what's in there. And as I think I mentioned earlier, ask questions until they hate you.
I love it. One of the things that I observed, and the reason that I went to California is the only state in the United States that I know of so far that has what's called nurse-to-patient ratios by law. So nurses in California, if you're in like a medical surgical unit, for example, can only have up to 5 patients. And whereas in Houston, actually in Las Vegas, I've had up to 13 patients in that type of a scenario. And one of the unintended consequences of that legislation was, number one, laziness, and number two, there's still so many problems in California. The legislation on that side where you're controlling, where somebody's forcing, the government by force is forcing the hospitals not to give nurses too many patients, and they still are doing some horrific things. I've been following the story of Lynne Spalding, a 57-year-old woman who went into the San Francisco General Hospital for a urinary tract infection. She was admitted. I'm thinking it's the money, because in this day and age she should have just gotten some antibiotics and gone home. She was admitted, and on the second day she went missing, and they didn't find her for over 2 weeks. She was in the stairwell, dead. And this is California, where there are nurse-to-patient ratios, and this type of, and the cover-ups. And I've been following this story very judiciously. The cover-ups from the media, not that have been reported by the media, and the sheriffs and all of this. I mean, and that's my issue with more legislation. Not that I'm against it, but we just have to be very wary of the unintended consequences when we have these things. So I think more powerful than legislation is reading your book. That would be much more powerful than trying to resolve this humongous government system that we have.
But you see, Lily, you're depending on the inherent righteousness of people that are surrounded by perverse incentives and by pressures of all kinds. And I don't know if human nature is that good.
Yeah, I understand what
I mean, money is a huge draw. Mm-hmm. And if you can sell a patient something they don't need, why not,
Right. What you did try to get some justice by using the system. Because, we've got a criminal system and we've got a civil system in our country. That didn't go so hot. So what advice would you give to persons who have already been victimized by the system, whether they're alive or they're a family loved one that is surviving? What advice would you give to them to get justice, or what is your advice to them?
Well, okay, the first thing you've got to do is get medical records. And then you've got to look and see if they're a reasonable representation of what you understand happened. Don't be surprised if you see some amazing things in there. Then once you've figured that out and put it together, and I can tell you this is not easy because you're grieving, you've lost a loved one, or you yourself have been seriously harmed. It's not easy. You're very vulnerable, and it's hard to recover. So it takes time. And of course, there's statute of limitations if you're going to do a malpractice thing. Once you get your bearings back, go to the director of the hospital and say, listen, this is the way I see it. I think your guys made some errors here, and see what you come up with. Chances are it'll be smoke and mirrors. A few places, there's a mechanism in place where the doctors, once they're willing to acknowledge that they made an error, will actually apologize genuinely for it, and they'll try to make things right. And there are some settlements that have not involved the legal system. They're simply made between the hospital and the people that were harmed, whether it's the survivors or the people that are physically disabled because they were mistreated in the hospital. Those are pretty rare. There's a lot of fear in admitting errors because of litigation. In Texas, it almost doesn't matter because the legislature, heavily influenced by the Texas Medical Association and the Health Association, Hospital Association, has managed to make patients basically pieces of meat, and you really don't have any redress in the state of Texas. I found that out. As you mentioned, I tried to get some justice. I went to the medical board and so on and so on. I even eventually went to the federal government because the last clinic where my son was seen was a federal clinic. But the federal government stonewalled me. And I'm not alone in that. I know of many other people in my situation or something like it that have been stonewalled by government, and I find that reprehensible since we pay the taxes that support the government. I would like to believe in the basic good of human nature, but what I found out about my son's doctors appalled me. Now, I think what you have to ask yourself, and I'm a good bit older than you. I'd go back. I was in college in the days of '64 and in the civil rights and all of that. I really think the laws that protect people because of their race or their age or their sexual preferences are useful, because I think people like that would never have gotten any level of protection because of human nature and who we are. You know, we all tend to see ourselves and then, well, they're different than us. They're black, they're gay, they're old. And what we really need to do in the medical system in this country is basically level the playing field. Here you've got a person who's ill and vulnerable, and they're going into a system that's designed to make as much money off of their illness as it can. And that's a recipe for disaster. Now, whether it's legislation or somehow making people more righteous, that has got to change fundamentally. How we do it, I don't know. I've been told by some people very high up in the medical industry that nothing's really going to change until patients raise a ruckus. And it's not happening yet. I think you're going to help raise a ruckus. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, that book, I could not put it down. This is the first time I've read a book with so much interest from start to finish. I mean, everybody needs to read this book, whether you're a nurse or, and I appreciate that you you have some areas that you highlight, or you bold. Those bolded things, text is very, very crucial. If people want to just get your book and just look at your bolds, I think they would be far better off and safer to get through the healthcare system than if they didn't have the benefit of that knowledge. I also liked the fact that you had like little quizzes that and what is it that you called it, like toolbox, right?
Yes, yes.
Those were great, and because I was challenging myself, and I did get one wrong, but I actually went back and I relooked, and it got me to think from a nursing perspective about things. But anybody can understand what you're saying, and if there's a word that you don't know, now with Kindle, all you have to do is touch the word, and the definition of the word comes to you. In this day and age, there's no reason why we can't get educated about our own health care. And you did such a beautiful job with your book. So the final question I have for you is, how has the public responded to your book? You did mention the cardiologist that reached out to you. Has there been anything that you would like to share with my audience?
Well, it's gotten pretty good reviews. One thing I learned about writing a book is once you get it written and published, you're not even a third of the way done, because if you don't know how to market it, right, which I don't and didn't, it's probably not going to go anywhere. It did get some attention through my church newspaper, actually a regional Methodist newspaper, and I had a couple interviews by local TV media that were good. They did tend to kind of keep the idea about medical errors at bay and just say this guy wrote a book you ought to look at, because that's a very touchy subject. And honestly, in Houston, where I live, the medical industry drives a huge number of things. If you look at the newspapers and the ads on TV, it's about medical care and medications and all that. And so if you attack that icon, you're not going to get your word out. So I think the acceptance has been very good. I have to say your acceptance and your encouragement is fundamental here. I hope a lot more people will read it. I think it's probably sold more than 500 books or so. I don't know. Once it went out on Kindle, I can't keep track of how many it sells. But the Kindle version is very inexpensive, and I hope, it seems like everybody's got a Kindle now. So maybe people will read it and wake up and say, wow, this is something else. And I can tell people, I wrote the book 6 years ago, but things are no better than they were 6 years ago. It just isn't. The same doctors that are grandfathered in for life, they could be 120 years old and still call themselves a board-certified cardiologist. It's just scary. I can tell you continuing medical education has not improved since the days when my son was seen. CME is silly. In Texas, still, the Texas Medical Board verifies only 1% of the doctors each year as to whether they have or have not done their continuing medical education. Would you get in a plane where 1% of the pilots are evaluated each year for competency to fly the plane? I don't think so. But in Texas, that's the health care you're getting. And like you said, you hate to make laws and trap all these doctors into things and nurses, but there's got to be a pathway that they have to stay on, and that pathway includes, humanness and competence and that kind of stuff. And you've got to keep them on that pathway.
Absolutely. And also transparency. I can't overemphasize the importance of being transparent in a healthcare setting. All of these things that you're forced to sign, that are gag rules and everything. Why would a doctor want you to sign it unless one reason would probably be lawsuits, obviously, but there are doctors who are really, really. I'm telling you, there was a doctor pair, the husband and wife that I met through my, I worked in a lot of places, so I'll just leave it to your imagination where this was, and they did so many C-sections, and every time we nurses would get or I would get a report, oh, it's that couple that did this C-section, so you better watch out for any kind of complications, but the patients loved those doctors because they had great bedside manners and, oh, what are you going to name your baby and all of this stuff. But literally, one of those patients at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning tried to get up to urinate, and the urine was coming out of her cesarean incision because they nicked the bladder. I mean, that is how awful, and the nurses, and that was one of the key points that Dr. Macquarie was saying in his book, is ask a nurse. Don't ask them, publicly or anything, but get the down low from a nurse who knows what's going on in the hospital settings if you want to feel for the culture. And he does have some good some good morals to some of the stories that he gives, and some light at the end of the tunnel, if you will, for some of the projects that he's been working on. But they all have to do with transparency, not necessarily pointing your finger at somebody and saying, oh, they messed up, but knowing what the problems are. Because, like the VA system, I worked there for a little bit. They have they gave really great care in comparison to some of these other hospitals who are profit driven. And one of their policies was, if you make a medication error, and I made one, you put all the information, you type it into the computer, it goes into a database so that the researchers can see the trends. And I think that's just so important, to be able to, to feel free to come forth and say, I made a mistake without because we're all humans and we're all going to make mistakes, and anybody in the healthcare profession who says that they never have is either lying or so stupid you don't want them taking care of you because they don't know. And I will humbly admit that I'm sure I did a lot of mistakes that I didn't even realize I made, because of the type of the numbers of patients that I was getting in various healthcare settings. So anyways, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, yeah, every time I listen to what you say, I get these ideas flood my head. And I would urge people to be very careful of doctors that are charming.
Yes.
I think a lot of incompetent doctors learn to be charming to keep their customer base up. And my son's doctors were pleasant gentlemen who didn't know what they were doing. And I'm not afraid to say that. Transparency is absolutely essential. I work in the space industry, and when we make a mistake in human spaceflight, everybody knows about it, and we look hard at why we made the error, and then we go fix the situation, the system, or the individuals that made that catastrophic error happen. And that doesn't really happen too much in medicine now, not nearly enough as it should. And so it's only by transparency and accountability that these things get fixed, and the number of people that die early begins to go down. And it can be measured because, as you said, there's a reliable database where you can look at these errors and say they're going down. I do want to say one more thing. I think doctors and nurses are very human, and I think there needs to be a system in place where if a nurse or a doctor is having a really bad day for whatever reason, maybe they're up with their baby all night, or their wife is just in a car wreck or something, and they're not really ready to do surgery that day or something, they just need to call a timeout and say, I'm not going to be able to deliver my best today. Let's please reschedule these surgeries, or I'm sick, I've got the flu. I don't think that happens very much. There's this kind of macho, tough it through thing, and I don't think that's in the best interest of patients. So there's huge cultural changes that are needed. So pick an area to try to fix, and let's all go try to fix it.
That sounds great. I've been following the story of the little girl, 12 years old, who had a bad tonsillectomy out in California. Have you heard anything about that?
Oh yeah, I followed that too. Yes.
And on Facebook, a lot of people are saying, well, they need to pull the plug, and I agree they needed to pull the plug and everything. But my position was keep her alive for as long as you possibly can, if for no other reason to start exposing what was going on behind the scenes, because there was a lot of bad stuff that happened. Why were they so quick to cut her up? And then you've got these Facebook judgmental people saying, well, it's the parents' fault because she's fat, and then because she's black, somebody said, well, she was on welfare and that's our tax money. That where is the human compassion there? Number one, and number two, I did read that the family did have some type of insurance, but why didn't the doctor advise nutrition, for the overweightness? That was allegedly the reason why they cut her tonsils out, because of her case with apnea. So there were a lot of things that could have and should have been done before these invasive things, which is the undertone or the message, one of the main messages of your book. But we need to be aware of them, because a lot of times we don't even know what questions to ask, and so I think by reading your book, it'll at least give you a starting point for where to start to ask questions, how to get on Google. I mean, in this day and age with Google, you should be able to Google just about anything, and start looking at alternative healthcare, or go to check out a chiropractor instead of a back surgeon who is going to want to cut your spine, as opposed to you know what I mean, the financial incentives that you're talking about. So,
well, can I say one more thing? Because you bring, okay, in my book I've got 6 facets of what informed consent is, and people need to look at that in the book. Doctors don't like it. If people will look at that and say, this is what informed consent is, and I insist on having it, they're going to be a lot better off. It goes back, ask questions, be assertive until they hate you. But your life's at stake. And I think if the parents of this young girl had asked, did she really need a tonsillectomy? She has sleep apnea. There are other solutions besides yanking out the tonsils. Had those been tried? She needs to lose weight. I saw a picture of her. Yes. And that's a cause of sleep apnea. Can we get her weight under control for that reason and many others? It's just, but they'll sell you surgery, because that's where the money is, folks.
Right. Where is Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson and all those loudmouths, Where are they?
Yeah, I don't know. But I'll tell you what, you're going to hear some of those folks from Texas. I'm interacting with some minority folks in this state that have really been roughshotted by medical care. And they know how to get their voices heard. And you will hear a cry from Texas within the year that goes national, I'll bet you.
That is, oh my gosh, that sounds so juicy. I just want to also say that because of the cost of our healthcare, there is a huge black market for healthcare. And I am of Mexican heritage, so my parents were both my mom was born in Texas but raised in Mexico. Long story short, I am bilingual, so I communicate a lot to the minority, the Hispanic communities. And what I have found is that there are illegals here in the United States who are doctors and are healthcare providers in their third world countries, and who can do things really, really cheap and a lot safer. Yeah, something big is going to happen, so I can't wait to know more about what kind of juicy stuff you're involved in out there in Texas, and maybe I'll get to meet you there when I go visit my grandson. So. Well,
if you're ever in Houston, you got to let me know, and we'll come and see you. and we'll have you out to dinner or something. I don't know about Mexican cooking but my wife can cook up stuff that you'll remember. She's a good cook.
Well, I appreciate that. Oh my gosh. Well, your book is so great, and I don't know why. Well, I do know why, but it really deserves to be on 60 Minutes or on 2020 or some mainstream media to give people awareness. But I just think that lamestream media has got too much of a too much connection with the evil forces that are perpetuating and increasing this horrific stuff that is going on in our healthcare system. So it's up to us to, loudmouths like TigerLily to find these juicy gems, these pearls of wisdom, and 5 stars on your book. My friend, thank you so much for writing it, and it reads beautifully, like a mystery novel almost, where it's like, and I had the inclination to think that it was an electrolyte problem and not a cardiology problem from the very beginning because of one of the things that you said, but indeed it just unfolds in a very compelling, exciting way, and everybody needs to read this book, and we need to translate it into other languages as well. So thank you so much. Do you have any final words?
No, just my thanks, and keep up the good work, and TigerLily, you got to raise a ruckus, and I appreciate you doing it in healthcare, and there's a lot of other of us out there that have a story to tell that you may want to tell to your listeners. It needs to be told. It's going on all around us, and it's got to change. You just can't have people dying because they just needed healing and didn't get it.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. I know you're busy, and my condolences again for your son. But I know that if he's looking down, if there is if he's looking down, he is proud of his papa. I'm telling you. So thank you so much, Dr. James, for being on my podcast.
Thank you, Lily. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.